On Halloween 1944, French police arrested a man who'd been on the run for 7 months. He had upwards of 50 different forms of identification on him. He claimed that he was a spy master, French resistance fighter. He also claimed that he'd been the mayor of a small French town. Some of that was indeed true, but the full truth about this man was spookier than any Halloween horror story. This is a horrifying tale of Marcel Petiot, perhaps the most evil, deranged doctor who ever existed. Where there's smoke, there's fire. 7 months earlier, on March 6, 1944, French police were called to investigate some foul-smelling smoke that was pouring out of a chimney of a house at 21 Rue Les Sueurs in Paris. It was a stylish 19th century home that apparently once belonged to some French princess. The smoke had been billowing out of the chimney for days, and the neighbors couldn't hold their noses any longer. Woo! Wow! Whoa! Woo! When the police arrived, they found a note stuck to the door that read, "Away for 1 month. Forward mailed to 18 Rue des Lombards in Auxerre." The neighbors told the police that they'd been noticing some curious activity in front of the house over the past 6 months. Carriages full of suitcases and sacks coming and going, a steady flow of nightly visitors making house calls. And now, this smoke. The police called Dr. Marcel Petiot, the owner of the home, who was at his other house just a few miles away. He was a physician who ran a successful medical practice in the city, successful enough to have 2 houses. If you squinted your eyes a bit and didn't read the fine print, Petiot was an upstanding citizen on paper. He told the officers to hold tight, that he'd be there in 15 minutes. The police didn't hold tight. Smoke kept billowing out of the chimney. Scared that the fire would spread, they broke in and went down to the basement where there was a coal-fired stove going at full blast. There was an arm sticking out of it. What the police found down in the basement could be best described as a dungeon of death. There were piles of bones, bags filled with your worst nightmares, and a soundproof chamber with shackles and a peephole. The horrified police ran back upstairs and then they ran out of the house. Soon after, Dr. Petiot rode his bike up to the house and started talking to the police. Let me repeat that. He rode his bike up to the house, a house filled with bodies, and started talking to the police. He told them that the remains were those of Nazis and French traitors, that he was an agent of the French resistance. He was a patriot, he said. The police inexplicably just let him leave. Nazis and traitors, you say? Well, thank you and good day. They wouldn't see him again for another 7 months. In the fog of World War II, with the Nazis ravaging Europe, it wasn't certain at first whether or not Petiot was telling the truth, but it quickly became clear that the French authorities were dealing with a monster. From problem child to problem veteran to problem physician. There were early signs that Petiot was going to be problematic. He was one of those kids who liked to collect roadkill from the side of the road and dissect it in his parents' basement. While there's no documented evidence that he did that, there are stories of his troubles in school. He was kicked out of quite a lot of them growing up for being, well, a dangerous creep. When he was 17, he was arrested for robbing a postbox. The charges were dropped after a doctor found that he was, quote, an abnormal youth suffering from personal and hereditary problems which limit to a large degree his responsibility for his acts. Petiot managed to finish his studies at a special academy in Paris in 1915, just in time to get drafted into the army and serve in World War I. In November of 1916, Petiot went to the Western Front. 6 months into his tour, he was gassed and wounded in the Second Battle of Aisne. While his physical wounds healed, his mental ones only got worse. He was again diagnosed as mentally ill, and during stints in various rest homes, which were like French halfway houses for traumatized veterans, he was accused of stealing everything from medication to blankets. Petiot's kleptomania and clear mental instability were not enough to keep him from the front, though, and in June 1918, he was sent back into battle. His second stint didn't last very long. Just a month in, he suffered a nervous breakdown and he shot himself in the foot, and shortly after that, he had what was most likely a seizure at a train station in Dijon. Was he allergic to mustard? In March 1919, he was yanked from the military for good. He was discharged with a disability pension, and a doctor recommended that he should be committed to an asylum. But in a wild twist, Petiot ended up working in one. He'd entered a higher education program designed for veterans and completed it in just 8 months. He then served a 2-year internship at a psych ward where he most definitely should have been a patient. In December 1921, Marcel Petiot became Dr. Marcel Petiot, and things would only get stranger from there. Mayor Petio. 5 years later, Dr. Petio would become Mayor Petio, or maybe Mayor Dr. Petio, or Dr. Mayor Petio. I don't know, whatever you want to call him. It's remarkable that this traumatized, depressed, kleptomaniac killer managed to pull off the things he was able to pull off. Despite all his mental problems, the man was smart, and he had charisma. In 1922, Petio moved to a small village 75 miles southeast of Paris called Villeneuve-Soyon, where he set up a private practice. And as you probably can guess from what we know so far about him, his practice wasn't exactly above board. He was a fan of prescribing people to the gills with really addictive medication for just about everything that ailed them. Petio's kleptomania and erratic behavior continued. He was kicked out of an apartment for stealing furniture. His own brother made him empty his pockets before he left the brother's home when he came to visit. Petio apparently bought a sports car and drove around the streets like a madman, causing quite a few crashes. Then, in 1926, he struck up a relationship with a woman named Louise Delavaux, the daughter of one of his elderly patients. The unfortunate young woman might have been Petio's first victim. Soon after the relationship began, Louise's house was mysteriously ransacked and then set on fire. Louise herself disappeared. And despite neighbors seeing Petio loading a big old suitcase into his car, and despite the fact that a similar suitcase with the remains of an unidentified woman was found in a nearby river a few weeks later, the police, they just let it go. No dots connected. They just figured Louise had run away and they closed the case. Now, I'm not really sure at this point whether Petio was a smart serial killer or it was just that the French police were so inept. Petio, like I said though, was charismatic. Just a few months after Louise Delavaux disappeared, he was elected mayor of Villeneuve-Soyon. As you can probably imagine, his campaign wasn't the cleanest campaign in the world. Reportedly, he had an accomplice cut power to the entire town during a debate with his opponent, so he couldn't respond to Petio's speech. As mayor, Petio's kleptomania leveled up. He started embezzling town funds. He stole the bass drum from a town band, and a large stone cross that was publicly displayed in the town that he didn't like too much. In 1930, history repeated itself yet again. The home of a woman named Henrietta Debouve was burned to the ground and her body was found inside. This time, a witness came out and was planning to testify that he saw Petio at Debouve's home the night of the fire. But for some inexplicable reason, the witness went to get treatment from Petio for rheumatism. Petio struck him with a needle and he died shortly after of an aneurysm. How convenient! By the fall of 1931, the town had had enough of Mayor Petio. He was removed from office after accusations of embezzlement and theft stacked up so high they could have dwarfed the Eiffel Tower. But Petio bounced back. A month later, he was elected as a town councilman, and he stayed on in that role for another year until he was convicted of stealing the town's electricity. The town's electricity! I mean, what wouldn't this guy steal? He was able to avoid jail time, though, and in 1933 he moved to Paris and set up another private practice. In Paris, things would take an even darker turn. No escape. In Paris, Petio basically ran a pill mill, a lucrative pill mill. He made tons of money, but was also investigated multiple times for medication violations. During this time, he also became certified to sign death certificates. Now that's a useful credential to have if you had a tendency to, well, create the deaths yourself. Stories of this guy can just go on forever. In 1936, he was caught stealing a book and then assaulted a police officer, actions that landed him in an asylum for a few months. He convinced the doctors, though, that he was okay. His mental break had been caused by an obsession he had with a new invention he was thinking of, a suction cup that could alleviate constipation. The guy was literally full of shit. Anyway, 1939 rolled around and the Nazis invaded Poland to kick off World War II. In June of 1940, they took Paris. The French resistance went underground. Now, a bit of context here. The Nazis occupied Paris from 1940 to 1944. It was a scary time for the city's residents. There were food shortages, curfews, censorship, and the ever-present threat of arrest and deportation, especially for Jews and those involved in resistance activities. Jews were forced to wear the Star of David on their arms at all times, and there were large-scale roundups and deportations to concentration camps. The French resistance was made up of people from all walks of life, men and women, young and old, from every social class, profession, and political leaning. There were communists, socialists, conservatives, Catholics, Jews, atheists. All these people were working together to oppose and undermine the Nazi regime. They conducted intelligence operations, they provided underground newspapers, they forged documents, and provided logistical support to the Allies. They also carried out sabotage missions against the German military and helped Jews and other people with Nazi targets on their backs to hide or escape to unoccupied regions or Allied countries. Marcel Petiot dove into this climate of resistance in a horrible way. Now, it started out as semi-legitimate. He forged medical documents to help persecuted people get out of forced labor. He also treated wounded Frenchmen coming back from the front. He established his own informal intelligence network, which he named Flytox after a brand of insecticide where information could circulate about Nazi weapons development and troop locations. But at the same time, Petiot was spinning yarns about fictional weapons he was developing that could make Nazis disappear. He was lying about high-level meetings he was privy to and battles that he never fought in. In 1940, Petiot established his own French resistance version of the Underground Railroad, except for the fact that it was all a scam. A deadly scam. The Mad Doctor went around claiming he could provide people fake documents and safe passage to Argentina. All they had to do was come to his house at 21 Rue Les Sueurs with all the valuables they were planning on taking with them. A 25,000 franc fee for his services and let him inject them with a vaccine he claimed was necessary for the trip. It wasn't a vaccine. It was cyanogen chloride. People started disappearing. Jews seeking refuge, compromised resistance fighters, even multiple pimps and their mistresses. Some bodies were washing up along the River Seine. Others were going in the coal-fired furnace in Petiot's basement. Now, it's possible that Petiot took the lives of 50 to 60 people during his horrible spree. Meanwhile, the Gestapo thought Petiot was running a legitimate escape network. The doctor was advertising it as such and wasn't too careful about keeping things a secret. In May of 1943, the Nazis arrested Petiot, whose code name was Dr. Eugene, along with 3 accomplices. They punished them for months, but Petiot was really just a serial killer and couldn't reveal any compromising information about the French resistance, even if he wanted to. The Gestapo eventually released Petiot, who now, ironically, had a cover story that gave him the confidence to ride his bike up to his little house of horrors after the police saw what was inside and convinced them he was a French resistance fighter who brought Nazis to his basement. Downfall. But Petiot knew the jig was up, and he went on the lam before the police realized that all the bodies in Dr. Eugene's basement, and even more that were dug up in the yard, were not in fact Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. Petiot had lots of identities to choose from thanks to all the IDs he'd accumulated from his victims. He chose the name Henri Valery and joined up with the French forces of the interior, a newly formed resistance group. He soon became a captain in the IFF, surely because of all the stuff he was spewing about being a spy and a weapons developer and all that. He was actually put in charge of counterintelligence and interrogating suspected Nazi sympathizers. All the while, he was wanted for mass killings. Eventually, his luck ran out. A French newspaper ran a story about Petiot accusing him of collaborating with the Nazis. Infuriated, he wrote a letter to one of his lawyers who defended him in one of the many cases he faced over the years. The lawyer forwarded the letter to the police, who now had evidence that Petiot was in fact still in Paris. In yet another bizarre twist, Petiot's alias, Henri Valery, was enlisted to help find the fugitive. So here's the deal. Petiot was recruited to help find himself. Literally, himself. He was finally caught, as we mentioned at the beginning. The ensuing trial, which began in 1946, was an international sensation. Petiot claimed again and again that he did what he did out of patriotism, that he was a hero. He was charged with 27 counts of killing and stealing upwards of 200 million francs from his victims. Petiot himself admitted outright to killing 19 of the 27 victims, while at the same time trying to maintain his innocence. Those 27 people were less than half of the 63 enemies of France that Petiot admitted to taking out during his 4-year spree from 1940 to 1944. On May 25, 1946, Dr. Marcel Petiot met the business end of a guillotine. Before the blade fell, he reportedly said, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look. This will not be pretty." Some say he had a smile on his face. What other deranged madmen do you want to learn more about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.